The year was 1959. In the heart of the Soviet Union, 9 individuals stood at the threshold of the northern Ural Mountain. They were not novices. They were seasoned mountaineers, hardened by years of navigating the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. Leading them was Igor Dyatlov, a man whose reputation for meticulous planning and calm judgment was known across the climbing community. Every member of the group had been vetted, tested, and prepared for the brutal reality of sub-zero temperatures and high-altitude endurance. Their objective was clear: a long-range trek through some of the most remote, untouched wilderness in the world. They moved with the precision of a unit. As they pushed deeper into the mountain range, the landscape shifted from rolling foothills to jagged, frozen peaks that scraped the sky. The air grew thin, biting, and sharp. They checked their compasses, verified their coordinates, and pressed forward, driven by singular ambition. They were 9 lives moving in perfect synchronization, unaware that the mountains were already watching, waiting for the moment their confidence would be tested. The rhythm of the march broke on the 3rd day. Yuri Yudin stopped, his breath hitching in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. He pressed a hand to his side, the sharp, stabbing sensation refusing to subside. He tried to push through, matching the pace of the others, but his gait faltered. Igor Dyatlov noticed the lag immediately. He signaled for the group to halt. They gathered in a tight circle, the wind whipping around them, as Yudin explained the worsening condition. It was a simple, brutal reality of the wilderness. A body that could no longer sustain the pace was a liability to the whole. The decision was made with clinical efficiency. Yudin would turn back. He handed over his share of the communal gear, his movements slow and deliberate. There were no long goodbyes, only firm nods, and the shared understanding that the mission took precedence over the individual. Yudin watched them for a moment as they reorganized, their silhouettes shrinking against the vast, white expanse. He turned his back on the peaks and began the long, solitary descent toward the nearest settlement. He walked away from the mountain, unaware that every step back toward safety was a step away from a fate that would soon claim the rest of his team. Behind him, the 8 moved forward, their formation tighter, their pace steady, disappearing into the biting cold of the northern Urals. The group of 8 moved forward, their formation now tighter, more compact. The landscape of the northern Urals began to change. The gentle slopes of the lower reaches gave way to jagged, frozen ridges that seemed to stretch into eternity. Every mile deeper into the range felt like crossing a threshold into a world that had never known human presence. The wind here was different. It did not merely blow. It scoured the earth, carrying fine, crystalline ice that stung the skin and obscured the horizon. They navigated by the sun, but the light was deceptive, bouncing off the endless white expanses to create illusions of distance and depth. They crossed frozen streams that groaned under the weight of the ice, and climbed slopes where the snow was packed hard as stone. There were no trees here, no landmarks to anchor their progress, only the vast, silent geometry of the peaks. The isolation was absolute. At night, the temperature plummeted, turning the air brittle and thin. They worked in silence, setting up camp with mechanical precision. The final ridge gave way to a plateau that felt stripped of all life. Igor Dyatlov stopped, his boots crunching into the frozen crust as he looked ahead. Before them rose Kholat Syakhl. It was a slope of jagged stone and wind-scoured ice, a barren expanse that seemed to repel the very idea of shelter. The name, whispered among local tribes as the Dead Mountain, hung in the air, a psychological weight that even the most seasoned veterans could not ignore. They stood in the silence for a long moment, the wind pulling at their gear, testing their resolve. There was no vegetation to break the force of the gusts, no cover to hide from the biting cold. They moved forward, their pace deliberate, the ground beneath them hard and unforgiving. They chose a spot on the slope, a place that offered no protection but provided the best vantage for their next day of travel. They worked with practiced efficiency, driving metal stakes into the frozen earth. The sound of the hammer striking the ground echoed across the empty basin, sharp and lonely. They finished the setup, the structure standing stark against the white, a small, fragile island in a sea of ice. The mountain loomed above them, silent and immense. Inside the tent, the world narrowed to the sound of breathing and the soft rustle of gear. The wind outside remained a constant, low-frequency roar, but within the walls, the air felt still. A small stove hummed, casting a faint, flickering light that danced across the canvas ceiling. They shared a meal, the simple act of eating providing a brief, grounding anchor against the vast, frozen void. Instead, they checked their maps, confirmed their route for the morning, and secured their equipment. The tension of the climb began to bleed away, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic fatigue of the day. One by one, they settled into their sleeping bags, the fabric rustling as they shifted to find comfort. The light from the stove vanished, leaving them in total darkness. Outside, the mountain continued its silent watch. The silence did not break. It shattered. A low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the frozen ground, traveling up through the floor of the tent and into the base of their skulls. Igor Dyatlov was the first to move, his eyes snapping open in the absolute dark. He did not speak. He did not need to. The air inside the tent had changed, becoming thick and charged, as if the oxygen were being pulled toward the canvas walls. Every member of the team sat bolt upright at the exact same moment. No one reached for a light. No one asked a question. The sound outside was not the wind. It was a rhythmic, heavy pressure that seemed to be testing the structural integrity of the tent from every side at once. The canvas groaned, snapping taut under an invisible weight. Panic did not grow. It arrived fully formed, a physical weight pressing down on their chests. Hearts hammered against ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm that drowned out the thrumming outside. The space, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The air turned sharp, metallic, and cold enough to burn the lungs. They were no longer hikers. They were prey. The fabric groaned, a high-pitched, tearing sound that signaled the end of their sanctuary. Igor Dyatlov lunged forward, his hands finding the heavy canvas. He did not look for a zipper. He did not look for an exit. He drove his blade into the wall of the tent and pulled down with every ounce of his remaining strength. The canvas parted with a violent, jagged rip. A rush of sub-zero air flooded the space, instantly erasing the warmth they had fought to maintain. It was not just cold. It was a physical blow that knocked the breath from their lungs. They did not hesitate. They did not gather supplies. They scrambled toward the jagged opening, limbs tangling in the dark. One by one, they forced themselves through the tear, tumbling out onto the hard, frozen slope. The wind outside was a wall of ice, but it was not the threat they were fleeing. They abandoned the tent, the stove, and the safety of their gear, choosing the lethal, biting exposure of the mountain over the suffocating terror they left behind. They hit the snow, their movements erratic and desperate, and began to move away from the site, driven by a singular, blind impulse to put distance between themselves and the place where they had been trapped. The slope of Kholat Syakhl was a jagged expanse of ice under the moonlight. They did not run as a group. They scattered like leaves, caught in a gale. Each step was a desperate, uncoordinated plunge into the crust of the snow. There was no rhythm to their movement, only the frantic, heavy impact of weight hitting the frozen ground. They moved toward the tree line, but their path was a jagged, erratic scar across the mountainside. Some footprints were deep, indicating a stumble. Others were shallow, barely skimming the surface as if the person were barely touching the earth. The most chilling detail was the lack of hesitation. They did not stop to gather gear. They did not stop to check on one another. They moved with a singular, blind purpose, feet bare and exposed to the lethal, biting cold. The wind whipped the snow into a blinding veil, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made. Yet the pattern remained clear enough to tell the story of a group in the grip of absolute, unreasoning panic. They were experts, trained for the harshest conditions on Earth, yet they fled into the storm as if the mountain itself were closing in to crush them. The distance between the tent and the forest grew, but the terror did not diminish. It followed them, a silent, invisible presence that drove them deeper into the dark, Weeks passed before the rescue teams reached the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. The mountain was a tomb of white, silent, and indifferent. When the searchers finally crested the ridge, they stopped. The camp was not a place of refuge. It was a scene of violent interruption. The tent stood half buried in a drift, its fabric shredded into long, jagged ribbons that snapped rhythmically in the wind. There was no movement inside, no sound of life, no sign of the 9 who had once occupied the space. The searchers approached with caution, their boots crunching into the hard-packed snow, but the silence was absolute. It pressed against their ears, heavy and suffocating. They reached the site and stood before the ruins. A stove lay overturned in the snow. A flashlight, half buried, was still switched on, its beam long dead. The investigators moved around the perimeter, their eyes scanning the ground for clues, but the scene offered only questions. The tent had been torn from the inside out. The investigators did not speak. They moved in slow, measured steps, the weight of the discovery settling into their bones. This was the aftermath of a terror that had left no witnesses. The searchers turned their gaze away from the ruined camp and toward the dark, looming wall of the forest. The wind had died down, leaving the mountain in a state of unnatural stillness. They moved in a line, eyes scanning the vast, undulating expanse of white. Then, a shadow broke the uniformity of the slope. It was not a rock. It was not a drift. One of the investigators stopped, his breath hitching in his chest. A few yards ahead, partially submerged in the snow, lay a human form. They approached with a mixture of dread and desperate hope, but the closer they drew, the more the hope vanished. The body was rigid, locked in the grip of the mountain. It lay face up, eyes fixed on the gray sky above. There was no movement, no sign of life, only the absolute stillness of a life extinguished in the cold. A few meters away, another shape emerged from the snow, then a third. They were scattered, as if they had collapsed while trying to reach the tree line. The searchers knelt beside them, their gloved hands trembling as they brushed away the frost. The skin was pale, hard as stone. The reality of the situation settled over the team like a shroud. The recovery was only the beginning of the nightmare. Weeks later, inside a sterile, fluorescent-lit room, the medical examiners prepared for the autopsies. They expected the standard markers of exposure: frozen tissue, blood congestion, and the quiet, tragic signatures of hypothermia. They were wrong. The first incision revealed a reality that defied every medical precedent they had ever studied. As the scalpels moved, the examiners stopped, their hands hovering over the tables in disbelief. There were no bruises on the skin, no lacerations, and no signs of external impact. Yet, beneath the surface, the damage was catastrophic. They found fractured skulls and ribs crushed into the chest cavity, as if the victims had been compressed by an invisible, immense force. The examiners looked at each other, the silence in the room growing heavy and thick. How could bones be shattered while the skin remained perfectly intact? There was no evidence of a fall from a great height, no sign of a struggle with a blunt object, and no explanation for the internal destruction. The logic of the mountain began to unravel. They were looking at a medical impossibility that defied the laws of physics and biology alike. The terror was now etched into the records, a permanent, inexplicable stain on the truth. The lead examiner stepped back, his face drained of color as he reviewed the X-rays. He had seen trauma before, but never this. The internal damage was not consistent with a fall or a blunt strike. It was a massive, singular event. He looked at the crushed ribs and the shattered sternum, then back at the pristine, unbroken skin. It was the kind of destruction usually reserved for a high-speed car crash. Yet there was no impact point, no surface bruising, no abrasions. It was as if a giant, invisible hand had squeezed the life out of them in a single, devastating pulse. The examiners moved from body to body, their movements becoming mechanical, almost hesitant. Every case followed the same impossible pattern: catastrophic internal trauma contained within a shell of perfect, untouched flesh. They tested the skin for hidden microfractures, found nothing. They checked for signs of external pressure, found nothing. The force had bypassed the surface entirely, focusing its fury on the skeletal structure and internal organs. The room felt smaller, the air thinner, as the realization took hold. Whatever had struck these mountaineers had not just hit them, it had passed through them like a shockwave. The investigation shifted from the morgue back to the mountain, searching for the missing piece of the puzzle. If a struggle had occurred, the terrain would have been scarred. The investigators combed the slope, looking for anything. A broken branch, a scuff in the snow, a single hair. They found nothing. The snow around the bodies was pristine, undisturbed by any movement other than the victims themselves. There were no tracks from an assailant, no signs of a second party, and no evidence of an animal encounter. The search teams widened their perimeter, scanning the edge of the dense forest, but the ground remained silent. It was as if the mountaineers had been attacked in a vacuum. The investigators checked the hands of the victims for defensive wounds, for skin under the nails, or for signs of a desperate fight. Their hands were clean. Their grip was empty. The lack of any external struggle turned the mystery into a terrifying, empty void. Every path they followed led to a dead end. There was no attacker to track, no weapon to identify, and no motive to uncover. The mountain had kept its secret perfectly. As the reports were filed, the absence of evidence became the most haunting detail of all. They were not just investigating a tragedy. They were staring into a silence that refused to speak. The investigators turned to the most logical explanation: a slab avalanche. It was a clean mechanical answer to a chaotic problem. They mapped the slope of Kholat Syakhl, looking for the telltale signs of a massive snow shift. They found none. The tent stood on a gentle incline, not a steep face prone to slides. If a wall of snow had descended, it would have crushed the canvas and left a debris field of ice and rock. The tent remained largely intact, its structure holding against the wind. The investigators walked the perimeter, searching for the telltale churned earth and compacted snow that follows a slide. The ground was smooth, undisturbed by the weight of a falling mass. Then they looked at the footprints. They were not the erratic, frantic lunges of people fleeing a crushing force. They were distinct, spaced, and led away from the camp in a line. If an avalanche had struck, the survivors would have been buried or forced to run in a blind panic. Instead, the tracks suggested a departure that was purposeful, even if it was desperate. The theory began to crumble. The avalanche was a ghost that never arrived. With natural explanations failing to hold, the investigation drifted into the shadows of the Cold War. The northern Urals were remote, but they were not isolated from the reach of the state. Rumors began to circulate among the local Mansi and other expedition groups in the region. They spoke of strange, pulsating lights in the sky, orbs of fire that defied the flight patterns of any known aircraft. These reports were not dismissed as mere folklore. They were recorded in official logs, adding a layer of unease to the already baffling case. Investigators started to look at the map with new eyes. Was the mountain being used as a clandestine testing ground for experimental weapons? The internal injuries, so severe yet lacking external trauma, mirrored the effects of high-pressure shock waves. It was a terrifying hypothesis. The group had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the blast radius of a secret military trial. The silence from government officials only fueled the fire. The tragedy was no longer just a mountain accident. It was a potential casualty of a silent, invisible war. The hikers had walked into the crosshairs of a power they could neither see nor understand. The search for a culprit shifted from the sky to the very air the mountaineers breathed. Scientists began to investigate the unique topography of Kholat Syakhl, proposing a theory that required no weapons and no government cover-ups. They pointed to the wind. When high-velocity gusts strike the jagged, uneven ridges of the northern Urals, they can generate infrasound low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing. These waves are not heard, but they are felt. They resonate within the human body, vibrating internal organs and triggering a primal, uncontrollable fight-or-flight response. The theory suggested that the mountain itself had become a massive, acoustic instrument. As the winds howled, the tent became a focal point for these invisible pressure waves. Inside, The hikers would have felt an inexplicable, mounting dread. Their hearts would have raced, their equilibrium would have shattered, and their minds would have been flooded with an irrational, paralyzing terror. It was a biological trap. The hikers did not flee from an enemy they could see. They fled from a physiological breakdown that made the air inside their own shelter feel like a cage. They were not escaping a threat. They were escaping the sound that was tearing their nerves apart. The mountain had not just killed them. It had forced them to destroy themselves in a desperate, blind attempt to find silence. When science reached its limit, the void was filled by the oldest stories of the North. The Mansi people had long regarded Kholat Syakhl as a place of forbidden ground, a site where the veil between worlds was thin. As the official investigations stalled, these local warnings transformed into a modern mythology. People began to whisper of ancient curses, of spirits that guarded the mountain slopes, and of entities that existed beyond the reach of human perception. It was a retreat into the supernatural, a desperate attempt to name the unnameable horror that had claimed 9 lives. The mountain was no longer just a geological feature. It became a sentient, malevolent force. Stories emerged of shadow figures seen at the tree line, and of strange rhythmic pulses that seemed to mimic a heartbeat beneath the permafrost. The mountain kept its secrets, and the world was left to wonder if some things are simply not meant to be understood. The legend of the mountain eventually collided with the precision of modern physics. Researchers began to model the slopes of Kholat Syakhl using high-resolution simulations, testing the feasibility of a rare, delayed slab avalanche. Unlike the massive slides that bury entire valleys, these small, dense slabs of snow can release with surgical force, striking the tent with enough kinetic energy to cause internal trauma without leaving external marks. It offered a chillingly plausible explanation for the crushed ribs and fractured skulls. But the physical damage was only half the puzzle. Investigators also turned to the phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, a physiological state where the brain, failing under the onset of severe hypothermia, misinterprets the sensation of freezing as intense heat. This explains why the hikers, in their final moments, discarded their layers in the sub-zero wind. It was not a choice, but a biological malfunction. These models provide a framework for the tragedy, stripping away the supernatural to reveal a sequence of brutal, natural events. Yet, the explanation feels thin against the weight of the mystery. It accounts for the broken bones and the discarded gear, but it cannot fully reconcile the sheer scale of the terror that drove 9 experienced mountaineers into the dark. Science has mapped the mechanics of the death, but the mountain retains its aura of the inexplicable. The data points align, yet the horror remains, refusing to be reduced to mere statistics. The mountain remains. It stands as it did in 1959, indifferent to the questions that still echo at its base. 9 lives were extinguished on those slopes, leaving behind a silence that no amount of research can fill. We look for patterns in the snow and logic in the tragedy, but the northern Urals offer no answers. They only offer the wind, the cold, and the vast, empty horizon. The hikers are gone, but their final, desperate flight into the dark has become a permanent fixture of the landscape. It is a stark reminder of the limits of human knowledge. We are left with the image of the tent, the torn canvas, and the footprints leading into nothingness. The mystery does not resolve. It endures. The mountain keeps its own counsel, and the story of the Dyatlov group remains, forever suspended in the biting air of the pass.